Welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the region. I would like to welcome you to the Faculty of Sport at the University of the West Indies Research Seminar Series. I am Dr. Shara Clarian, and it is my privilege today to be chairing this research seminar series. I would like to thank our audience, all the persons who joined us for our last seminar series with Miss Alison Facey, our PhD student. She did an excellent job, and I'm very excited today to introduce Dr. Sharmella Roopchand-Martin and Dr. Akash Dhanai. They will be presenting on a very insightful topic for us. They'll be looking at, as you can see here, the prevalence of sport and exercise injuries among the general population of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, Dr. Sharmella Roopchand-Martin is our very own Deputy Dean of Research and Grants. She has over 20 years of experience in scientific research and education at the tertiary level. She also engages locally with the Jamaica Rugby Football Union and as their vice chair, and also with the Jamaica Hockey Federation. Dr. Akash Dhanai, he is our very own decorated past student. He presently serves as the medical director of the Felicity Medical Clinic and head of sport and exercise science at the Trinidad and Tobago's Football Association. Welcome to you both.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, we're hearing you.
Thank you, Shara. And thank you to everyone who would have joined the presentation. So in going ahead with the presentation, I will discuss the background and the literature review, the methodology, and Dr. Roopchand-Martin will discuss the results and discussion, and then finally, I will conclude. Next slide. Right. So when we look at the global prevalence of sports and exercise-related injuries across the board, we would have noticed that the numbers are significant, and they are high. So it's a prevalent issue. One of the things we would have noted, though, in terms of data that's lacking in the literature is that most of the sample size being used in the research that would have been done already were in particular populations, meaning those who would have only presented to hospitals or those who would have been hospitalized, or even particular types of sports, or even things like collegiate athletes. So it's not really that of the general population we are looking at. And therefore, most of the research would have had done before would have somewhat underestimated the actual prevalence, which is why we thought a research of this type would have been needed. If we look in terms of some of the previous studies would have been done, and we quote some of the figures we see here in the United States, 3.6 million persons would have presented to the emergency department in 2022. A 5-year review between 2012 and 2016 revealed 77,000 persons hospitalized, and this is 77,000 per 100,000, which is quite significant. In New South Wales, we see 195 per 100,000, and this probably, I think, is on the lower end of the data we would have gotten. But as I said, these were those who would have been hospitalized, which excludes a large amount of persons who may have had injuries and were not included in the sample size. In Netherlands, it's 3.5 million persons, and in Denmark, we see 18.4% in adults and 19.3% in children. And in this case here, it's not that may not be as significant, but this trend in terms of children being more prevalent than adults is something we would have seen in most of the data looking through the literature. Okay, next slide. Right. So as I was explaining, the trend of injuries being more prevalent in the younger age group is something we would have seen. And probably for many different reasons, it's known that biologically children or younger persons may have less muscle mass, lower BMI, which may mean that they may have a weaker musculoskeletal system, may put them at risk of getting injuries. Yeah, previous slide. Yeah. The neuromuscular system may also be still developing, especially in the younger age group, 5 years and around that may also predispose to certain types of injuries. So we see for different reasons that children or younger persons may be more prevalent in terms of injuries. And if we even look at the numbers in the United States, it shows around 65% of injuries between this age group of 5 to 24 years, with most being between 5 to 14 years. And post-COVID, we would have seen a little change in the trend where the prevalence would have gone up between the age ranges of 15 to 24, which could be as a result of the increase in exercise activity that may have been taking place during the lockdown and even after the lockdown in terms of this age group, which is even a trend we would see when we look at the data with the types of activities being participated in and the association with injuries. Next. So also when we look at the gender and its association with injuries, we see a trend in the absolute figure where males may have a predisposition to injuries. But when we look at the statistics and the significance in terms of the general population, and I know Dr. Roopchand-Martin will talk a little bit about this, but when you look at the statistics and calculating the p-value, this was not found to be as significant when we look at the general population, but rather so we see that there's a trend in the types of injuries being associated with different genders. Well, when we look at that, I mean, it has been discussed in the literature already that certain types of injuries like ACL injuries may be associated with females for different reasons, biomechanical reasons, hormonal reasons, and certain types of injuries may be associated with males for particular reasons, such as the males may have a bigger body mass or higher muscle mass, so they may be engaging in a little higher velocity sports. And previous slide. Yeah, and this may predispose to more type of collision and trauma-related type injuries. So if you look at some of the data, we would see in the US, there were 86 episodes per 1,000 persons for males and 66 per 1,000 for females. In the US post-COVID, we see 2.3 million in males and 1.2 million in females. In Australia, Queensland Hospital, we saw hospitalization of 130 per 100,000 population versus 28.9 per 100,000 males versus females respectively. In New South Wales, we saw almost 3 times that amount in males versus females. And in China, amongst these college students, we saw a 48% of prevalence in males versus 32 in females. So we see this trend building of not so much the absolute figure in terms of prevalence with males versus females, but certain types of injuries, as I was explaining, and we'll see that when we go on to the next slide. Yeah. Next. Right, and this is somewhat what I would have touched a bit on earlier, where we talk about certain types of injuries more so being prevalent with different genders. Yeah, next. When we look at the activity or the types of activity associated with injuries, we would have noticed that it's somewhat cultural, if we use that word, and also based on the regions where the studies are taking place. And that's expected because different regions may participate in different type of sports and different type of exercise activities based on their culture, and therefore the prevalence will be higher in those types of activities versus different areas or different regions. And we see that when we look at the trends. In the United States, we see the higher numbers in American football or NFL, basketball, soccer. In Australia, we see higher numbers being involved in team sports involving a ball, so things like rugby and even Australian rules football. And in Europe, we see football or soccer is high there. And in China, more so racket sports, badminton, and table tennis being involved there, in addition to some of those other sports that would have been mentioned. So we see a trend being built with terms of cultural and geographic type of activities being involved, associated with injuries. Next. Could we just go back? One thing I forgot to touch on there was that post-COVID-19, we saw, and we should take note of this, a rise or general exercise being involved rather than formal sports in terms of the association with injuries. And I would have mentioned a little bit earlier that during the lockdown, there was probably likely an increased involvement with general exercise because formal sports would not have been taking place. And we tend to see this trend notably in general exercise post-COVID-19, that the association of injuries are higher post-COVID lockdown. When we look at the regions of the body being associated with injuries, across the board, we would have noted that lower limb injuries are most prevalent, followed by upper limb injuries and head and neck injuries. In Netherlands, there was 78.6% of lower limb injuries, and Chile, 63%. And I think this really draws into perspective the importance of the lower kinetic system in terms of, even in a predominantly overhead athlete or sport we may consider upper limb sport, like a throwing sport, for example. But the importance of the lower limb, and I'm sure some of the persons in physical therapy could agree that the important in even rehabilitation and the stress the lower limb or the lower kinetic system undergoes in terms of generating force and absorbing stress, which puts that region of the body at a higher risk of injuries. We would have, in the study in Queensland, Australia, they would have noted a higher amount of injuries being the nature of strains, muscle strains, and secondly, followed by ligament type injuries with fractures being third. Therefore, what we can draw from that is that the higher velocity type injuries tend to be a little less common than lower velocity soft tissue type injuries, muscle strains, or even sprains. Yeah. Next. So why do the study? We, as I mentioned, we would have noted in the data, there was a gap in knowledge or gap in the data where most of the research were not representative of the general population. Also, we would have noted that the different regions have different involvement in sports, and we don't have any data at all for the Caribbean and the type of sports we participate in, the type of activities we participate in, and therefore we don't have data as to what type of injuries may be involved in our population. But also we know that there's a high prevalence of communicable diseases, chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension. And there, all over the world, there are campaigns to for health promotion and in terms of exercise activity in the United States, there's ACM guidelines and the exercise is medicine program and policy. There's CARICOM has the Caribbean moves. Jamaica, I know Jamaica has Jamaican moves. Dr. Martin was mentioned to me yesterday, and we have TT moves. So we see a lot of different areas adapting this health promotion policy that falls under the guidelines and follows the guidelines of the ACM recommendations. And if we're promoting health, we think that through exercise, we think that the incidence of exercise type injuries would be increasing. And one of the reasons also why we do the study is not just so that we promote exercise, but we have the data so that we can show its injuries are prevalent and associated with exercise. And the incidence of injuries will go up. And therefore, we need not just to promote exercise, but promote safe exercise. We need to lobby for to have trained sports and exercise medicine personnel involved in these health promotion practices so that we can mitigate the risks in terms of the injuries that will rise with exercise and also manage the injuries that will rise with exercise. And this has also been hypothesized that as countries and as persons try to adapt more so to the ACSM guidelines in terms of exercise prescription, that it's hypothesized that injuries might even increase. So therefore, we need to take the right steps so that we help do it healthy. We help promote safety exercise or safe exercise also. Yeah. Now, the type of research that we would have conducted was a cross-sectional survey where we would have determined the sample size based on our population of 1.3 million, and the sample size was determined to be 1,039 persons. And this was conducted through calling persons and administering a questionnaire over the phone. We would have stratified the sample size to reflect our already existing regional health authority distribution, where 40% of the sample size was allocated to the Southwest region, 25% to the North Central region, 22% to Northwest, 8% to Eastern, and 5% to Tobago. And the reason why is that if we are looking at developing policies and programs, it would have to be developed and adapted to the already existing system which we have in terms of the healthcare system here, so that we can know where to implement procedures and implement programs. And that's why we collect data in that. We have decided to collect data in terms of that pattern and distribution. Random selection was done through the telephone directory, where we would have used a computerized system so that we could have randomized the numbers, and we would have called persons until we met that quota for the particular region. Next slide. Right. Once we would have called persons, we would have ensured that we would have spoken to an adult, and we would have gotten informed consent. We would have then administered the questionnaire to that person and anyone else in that household that may have had a sports or exercise related injury, and we would have collected data from them. The definition we used to incorporate persons into our sampling would have been any injury that occurred during exercise, during the warm-up, during actual exercise, or during the cool down, or whether it's contact or non-contact, or an injury that may not have happened directly during this process, but is known to be associated with the type of activity they are engaging with in terms of overuse type or degenerative type injuries. The injury must be symptomatic within the past 6 months, even though that the actual inciting incident would have been before. Next. Right, so I think Dr. Roopchand-Martin will take over here a bit.
Yeah. So just to clarify for you, or make sure that you understood correctly, the participants, so in calling up, we're calling up people and asking, had they been participating in any form of sports or exercise related activity within the past 6 months? And then we're capturing the information as to whether they'd sustained an injury or not. So what we would have had is, over the past 6 months, 1,039 persons being interviewed who would have been engaged in some level of sport or physical activity, not necessarily meeting ACSM guidelines. So we weren't focused. We did capture data as to how many were actually meeting the guidelines, which I'm not presenting here, but they had to have been engaged in some form of physical activity, not necessarily at the guidelines within the past 6 months. This data collection was reflective of the 6 months just before we headed into COVID-19. So it's up until December 2019. That data would have been collected. So the 6 months leading to December 2019. After that, we went into the COVID period. We did get the 1,039, but there were a couple of them that when we were entering the data, I think there might have been just errors, or we had a lot of missing. So we ended up with analyzing data for 1,035 persons. The age range was 18 to 92 years, with the mean age being 45 plus or minus 19.79 years. In terms of the group that we surveyed, we had 55.7% of the group had received education up to tertiary level, 35.8% secondary level, and 8.5% primary level only. So that's the highest level of education accomplished. And this is not surprising for Trinidad, and I guess it's representative of the population, because we need to remember the literacy rate in Trinidad is pretty high, and a large chunk of the population there actually completes both secondary and moves on to primary school education. When we look at the makeup of the sample, in terms of ethnicity, 46% was of East Indian descent, 24% African, we had 12% mixed, and other was 10%. There was missing data regarding ethnicity on 8% of the group who opted to not select any of the options that we provided. So they refrain from identifying ethnicity. In terms of geographical distribution, the largest group came from Southwest, followed by North Central, and of course, the smallest representation would have been Tobago. And remember, again, that would have been based on the fact that we were doing stratified quota sampling based on the population size as a reflection of the entire country. So we would have gotten the targeted sample that we wanted for the respective areas. So what did we find in terms of injury prevalence? And again, I want to emphasize that you have to be careful with how you look at our data relative to the literature that Akash was presenting previously, because as he mentioned, the previous data includes not just the general population, but also competitive sport. So statistics would have been higher for those areas. Our data, we would have excluded persons that were in focused competitive sporting activities, meaning that they're more at that semi-professional, professional level, where they're playing with, you know, structured teams representing country. Those persons would have been excluded from our study. So we were looking at people that really, in screening them by telephone, they're really doing sport more from a recreational perspective, and their exercise activity is centered around more, health, the way they look, etc., but not about high performance athletic training. So of the group that participated in the study, 14% reported having sustained a sport or exercise related injury over the 6-month period. And we calculated what that worked out to be in terms of probability. So we had data that would have allowed us to estimate the total occurrence of exercise over the 6-month period. So the total occurrence of an episode of exercise over the 6-month period. And the probability estimates during that window of time was 27 injuries per 10,000 occurrence of exercise activity. 64% of these injuries were seen in males. And that's when we look at the total sample. So 64% of the injuries were reported from males, but the males in the group as a total would have represented the larger percentage of our sample, which is not very different from what you see published out there. What is important, however, is to look at the last bulleted point where when we look at analyzing statistically, what is the prevalence rate amongst the females versus the males, you'd see that it really is not different. So when you look at the total, whilst it looks as if males may be having more injuries, that's just reflective of the fact that it's a greater percentage of the males that are engaged in the population in sport and recreational exercises as opposed to females. But if I take within the group and I just say, of the females who exercise, what percentage of them become injured? And of the males who exercise, what percentage become injured? It really is not significantly different. And again, this finding is pretty much identical to what's been reported in the literature, where by group, as you look at the group in isolation, the occurrence of injury or the rate of occurrence of injury is not very different, or prevalence. So incidence is not very different. The prevalence is not very different. If you look at males as a group by themselves and females as a group by themselves. When we look at the distribution of injury by age, you'd notice that our largest group was persons in their 20s. So 20s, the teens, 20s, 30s basically is the bulk of where injuries had occurred. By 40s, 50s, 60s, injuries are going down in terms of occurrence. So the mean age of the people who had injury, the mean age was 31.9 years, plus or minus 12. For persons who had no injury at all, the mean age was 47 years, plus or minus 20 years. And that was statistically significant. If we look at distribution by geographical location, so injury distribution by geographical location, Northwest and Southwest Trinidad had almost equal percentages that presented with injury. And these would have been also the largest sample sizes that we were having. Tobago, the prevalence of injury in Tobago was the lowest. But again, when you run statistical analysis on these, the data is showing that the prevalence, there's no significant difference in the prevalence of injury based on geographical location itself. But you will see percentage values being a little bit higher just based on the fact that we had a larger representation from that area. But statistically, it's not that we're seeing more injuries in Southwest or Northwest in terms of rates. The rate at which injury occurs as a percentage of the population, it's not statistically different. If we look at prevalence of injury by ethnicity, this is where we had some statistical significance, and what we're seeing is that the persons who identified as just being of other ethnicities had a higher injury prevalence compared to the other ethnic groups. So our East Indian, African mixed, and we had the other group, which would have been, I guess, people who would have been, the Syrians, Caucasians, and, all the other mix that makes up Trinidad and Tobago. So that was a little bit significant, and it's something that we probably need to be paying attention to in terms of, wondering, is it more about any possible genetic factors in there that might be predisposing persons of these other ethnicities to injuries, or is it more related to lifestyle and maybe the kinds of sporting activities, recreational activities that they may be involved in, which we didn't break out analysis by that, but just to point out that it's something to sort of keep at the back of the mind. The persons of African descent had the lowest prevalence of injury in their group. When we look at injury in relation to education, if I look at the total sample, so of the total sample who had injury, 78% of those had been educated up to the tertiary level. There was nobody in the group that had injuries whose education was only at the primary school level. And if I look at the percentage of injuries that occurred within the educational groups themselves now, 19.8% of those who had been educated at tertiary level had an injury during the 6-month period. 8.6% of the total population who participated had an injury in that secondary age group level, education level, sorry, and nobody in the primary education level group only had injuries. This data is actually very, very, very consistent with what is reported in the literature, where generally it's persons with higher level of education that presents more with sport and exercise related injuries. And the reason for that is there are different speculations. One, of course, is your persons with higher education backgrounds being a lot more aware about the importance of participating in sport physical activity. So from just a health fitness perspective, the impact on their well-being. They're the ones that are a little bit more educated, not just about the importance of participating. So you're seeing a higher percentage participating, but they may also have more information about safe engagement in sporting activity. And if you look at those persons like who may be going to the gym, fitness centers, etc., they may be the ones that are also more able to afford paying for exercise type interventions that is supervised as opposed to unsupervised. So that's one school of thought there with regards to why we're seeing injuries more in them, because they are actually more engaged in physical activity than person who has a lower level of education. So it's looking at proportionally they're a larger group. The other thing is, on the flip side, the persons who are educated to primary school level only, the expectation and the finding that most of these people are engaged in professions that require a lot more physical manual labor, and they're generally a bit more conditioned. So when they do go out in terms of participating in sport and recreational activities outside of their jobs, their overall level of fitness and conditioning is higher, so their risk of sustaining an injury is lower. So those are, just some of the things that are put out there in regards to, the education aspect and what we're seeing with regards to injury occurrence and education. In terms of the kind of activity that was associated with injury, The number one was persons engaging in, weights, resistant type training stuff. So whether it be at a gym or they're doing it at home with their own hand weights, etc. So weights resistance training was the highest, followed by football and cricket for us. And as Akash would have mentioned, a lot of, the top 5 is really dependent on the region where people are located and what are the popular activities in those regions. So football almost consistently was showing up very heavily for just about everywhere in the world except China. Cricket wasn't mentioned in any of the previous research. We were a little bit surprised because we thought Australia would have had cricket somewhere in their top 5 because it is a big, sporting nation, but cricket wasn't in their top 5. And that might be because we're looking at, in Australia, their data was captured from hospitalization. And it may simply mean that cricket, whilst we have, quite a bit of recreational injuries were occurring, they may not be of the magnitude to turn up in the hospital. So cricket wasn't picked up in the, Australian group in their top 5. I want to point out that concept of, weights, resistance training, the general exercise type stuff, that is similar to what we were seeing in the US data that was captured for 2022. So the post-COVID data for the US, when we presented that data, you would have seen that prior to COVID, American football is where the highest occurrence of injury had occurred. But the 2022 data for the country is showing that the majority of sport and exercise related injury, the number one was just engagement in general exercise, which would be similar to the weights resistance training type stuff in our group. And for the US data, their hypothesis has been that there is actually a linear increase in the occurrence of injury with persons trying to meet the ACSM guidelines for health and fitness. When we look at distribution of injury by body area, similar to what has been reported in the literature, lower limb is at the top of the list for us as well, followed by upper limb, and then lumbar spine, head and neck injuries, then the other areas. So very similar to what's been reported already in the literature. If we look at the type of injuries that were sustained in our group, non-contact sprains, strains. So the overuse type injuries and the non-contact injuries, these are the most prevalent ones, followed by the high velocity injuries coming, later on. So again, similar to what we see in the literature out there. In terms of management, you'd see that 71.1% of the group received some form of prescription for medication. 31.7% were recommended to physiotherapy. We had 18.6% who had no form of treatment. We had 15.2% that actually required a little bit more in terms of cast or splinting. So you can suspect that that would have been a more significant injury for those individuals. And 8.2% just had advice that they were given about the injury, but nothing else was, recommended. And all persons recovered to some level. What we didn't capture, though, is how long it would have taken them to recover. And even though they say they recovered from that injury, we don't know what would have happened, subsequently, because once you've sustained an injury, it's usually easier for re-injury to occur. So since we were not following the cohort forward in time, we're not sure if recovery was truly full recovery and they were able to go back to doing everything with no, future injuries being sustained, or, were they able to play and perform at the previous level? The recovery was really based on they were not having pain, discomfort, or any significant problems at the particular time, but not that, they were, had any form of investigations or anything done for the area to say that, hey, physiologically, you are fully healed from the injury. So I'll hand back over to Akash to wrap up with you. But before he wraps up, again, wanting to emphasize that a big driver for us doing the research is related to the fact, as was mentioned previously, globally, we have campaigns that are running to promote physical activity. If you are promoting physical activity, once you're promoting physical activity, engagement in sport, engagement in some form of exercise, you will have injuries occurring. The fact that people participate in sport and exercise, there is a risk for injury, and injuries will occur. So as we embark on these kinds of promotions, we actually need to be understanding what do we have existing in our current context. So promotions don't just lead to a different kind of burden on our health sector. So we're trying to promote fitness to prevent non-communicable diseases, but we also need to understand what's happening in our context. And that was one of the drivers for doing the research. And what you're seeing in the findings of our study is a pattern that's not very different from North American countries, from Europe, from China. So we're seeing patterns that we do need to be wary of and be concerned about. So Akash, I'm going to hand back over to you to just wrap it up in the context of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah. So basically, in conclusion, what we would have seen is that, yes, we are seeing patterns of injuries of sports and exercise activity in our population. It somewhat is related to some of the trends of data we'd have seen in the literature review, where involved younger persons in that 20 age group and less, also males, and as I said, most of the types and association of injuries associated with males and females, and those persons of higher educational status. And I know we were speculating, and Dr. Martin was speculating on some of the things that could be leading to a higher incidence of injuries in these persons. I also think, and I would add to that, is that it could also be speculated that these persons are more reporting injuries because of their educational status, in terms of they may more think that, okay, this is an injury and something is wrong here, and they will report it as an injury, whereas someone who may not be as academically inclined might think, okay, it's just a little niggle, that's not an injury, let me leave that alone, and may not report it as an injury. So those could be some of the things that are leading to a higher reporting of injuries in these or that population. I think that the data shows that, yes, this is a prevalent issue, and it really draws into context that we need to get sports and exercise medicine personnel involved in the promotion of exercise and involved in all these campaigns that are taking place in the promotion of exercise, and also the promotion of healthy exercise prescription, in terms of warm-up, in terms of cool-down, in terms of the different components of exercise, not just aerobic training alone, but the different components of exercise. And also the management of exercise-related injuries. And if you could just draw back to the previous slide, Dr. Martin. If you just go back to the previous slide, one thing I'll also mention here is that when we look at our findings, we noticed that most of the treatment options involve medication, and a lesser amount involves physical therapy and physical rehabilitation, whether it's formal or not. But I think most persons in the field of sports and exercise medicine would advocate for a higher percentage of physical therapy and rehabilitation in terms of the recovery of that person from an injury. And I know we would have mentioned, not just for Dr. Martin was talking about, we didn't follow up in terms of longitudinally to look at whether they were really recovered or not. But in terms of return back to their activity in a acceptable time is also something that would be important if we rehabilitate and manage people properly. And yeah, so I think that's pretty much shows the importance of getting, properly trained persons involved in terms of the management of these persons. Yeah. So I think that's it for the presentation.
Yeah.
I'll hand over to Shara. Yeah.
Yes, Shara. Shara was having some problem. Yeah,
I was
you there?
having some problems. Hi, everyone. I thought it was quite amazing when you guys realized that as we're globally encouraging movement and physical activity in the fight against non-communicable diseases, something that's always or very much required at this stage is raising the public's awareness and educational status on identifying injuries and injury prevention. And I think that's something that needs to be coupled with these initiatives of physical activity and movement. At this time, I would like to welcome the audience. Is there anyone with any questions or comments for researchers?
As we're waiting to see if anyone has questions, I just want to point out, Shara, because it wasn't mentioned in the introduction, that this is actually work that was done by Akash for meeting the requirements of his master's degree. So, congratulations to Akash. I think it was a tremendous amount of work done. Not many people go out there and capture data from a sample as large as, what Akash did. So he is to be commended. Yeah. There's a question on, is it that most of the injuries occurred in the gym? It's not necessarily that most of the injuries occurred in the gym, because for some of these people, the weights resistance exercises that they were doing were gym, but some of them were in their home environments. It's people who were doing weights resistance activities primarily unsupervised. And some of those were unsupervised in the gym as well. So those resistance training exercise injuries, just getting into doing resistance training without proper supervision, especially if you don't know anything about resistance training before. And that's what happens when you advocate for people to just go out and exercise, but you don't walk them through safe exercise. I'm seeing Dion.
I would
Go ahead,
also
Akash.
say that I think that may be an avenue for future research, because seeing that we have built the trend to show that resistance training has a high prevalence in our population for injuries, it may worth looking at what predisposes these people, these persons, whether it's lack of supervision, it's improper technique, to determine what may be involved, so that proper things protocols can be put in place to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, I will come back to Dion, whose hands was up, because I just want to follow on the same thing. The other thing is, when we promote physical activity, you'd see a lot of people basically saying that once you reach 40, you have to add resistance training in there. Resistance training is probably one of the most important things for maintaining bone density and reducing the atrophy and the deterioration that we see in muscle fiber associated with power strength that occurs with aging. So you see exercise campaigns that will promote that, especially for persons 50 and older. As we age, we need to have resistance training in there. But are we telling them how to go about this properly, versus you just go and pick up some weights and think, oh, this is what I can manage? Dion had her hand up with a question. Dion?
I just wanted to know what percentage of those injuries occur if it was done now with actual athletes.
No,
within
so you may
structured
have missed,
sports.
right, you may have missed the very beginning part of the presentation. Our
Yes, I did.
focus wasn't, right, so our focus was not on the athletes. Our focus was just looking at the general public in Trinidad and Tobago who are engaged in sport and recreational activities for health, wellness, just you get out there and you exercise. So anybody who would have been structured athletes that are playing, you know, at or competing at a high level, that wasn't the focus for the particular study.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Good. And we have another comment in the chat. It said, so, and this is in relation to the previous question that we were targeting, if higher level education didn't have an impact then on the resistance training.
Not necessarily, because remember, what I was saying is that the more educated you are, the more aware you are of the impact of exercise for reducing your risk of non-communicable disease. So you have a little bit of a higher awareness that, you know, hey, I need to exercise. You probably are better able to afford to, you know, pay to go to an exercise program, take up a membership with a gym, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that you are well educated about the components for exercise, having a proper warm-up, you know, your cool down. This is how you structure a resistance training program. Resistance training is actually technical, and it's only people who are specialists in, you know, exercise, your fitness trainers, your strength and conditioning coach, your sports coaches, because some of our sports coaches are trained in the strength and conditioning aspect yourself, your physical therapist. You actually have to be trained in how to set up a resistance training program and to execute it. So your average person with a higher level of education, they'd be aware of the general recommendations that are out there, that we must engage in, you know, physical activity for health benefits, but they're not necessarily educated about how to set up and how to execute a safe resistance training program.
Thank you. And I actually agree with Kanisha. So she has a comment and she says, are there any further plans to explore this research in the general population of Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean islands? No pressure, Dr. Martin and Dr. Dhanai, but I would love to know that as well. What are we going to do with all of this data that you've captured?
So, Kanisha, in response to your questions, yes, these are the kinds of projects that we encourage our students to engage in. I didn't have, this student hasn't presented, but one of our previous sports medicine student had just started off this kind of research in Trinidad, just looking at the people that were presenting to their chronic disease clinic and looking at the extent to which they are actually following through with recommendations and engaging in exercise, and, you know, what are the barriers, etc., to exercise for that group. And that's some interesting data for just, you know, a small group in Trinidad, that they're definitely not engaging in the level of exercise that they need to do. We have data for Dominica from a student that, not Dominica, sorry, St. Vincent, from a student that has looked at, again, engagement in exercise for wellness purposes with people that present to their chronic disease centers. So yes, there are plans to continue to explore these, and those plans are executed in the framework of our graduate and our undergraduate students across the Caribbean region being guided to engage in this type of research in their countries.
Absolutely. So we have other comments in the chat. We have Christopher Jackson. He's saying that this is an interesting topic. Sport overall is evolving, so I know we will be very instrumental to the development of sports worldwide. And I agree with that. And I'm really hoping to see the marrying of injury prevention with the promotion of physical activity. We have another comment saying, can you conclude that school-age children did not have high injury prevalence from the sample population?
With certainty, because our sample really was 18. The minimum age in our sample was 18. So I think we would require a little bit more strategically looking at that age 5 to 18 age group. We may have had persons in the group that their families did have children that were in that primary high school age, but they just didn't agree for them to have their data included in the study. So just keep in mind that our target group, the minimum age that was in the population that participated was 18.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question/comment from Dr. Facey.
Hi everyone, greetings. I did not hear the entire presentation, but there was a point made regarding the response rate and that some persons failed to answer all the questions. And given that you have such a large population in the sample of over 1,000, I'm assuming that this was, the data was collected via the Google form or SurveyMonkey, some online medium, right?
No, this was a telephone survey.
Oh, it was telephone.
So it was a telephone survey that was done. So we just had a few persons. So the targeted sample was 1,039. And when we cleaned up the data, we had 1,035 that was included in the data analysis. Yeah, so we didn't bother just going after the other, few of them. So we have 1,039 for complete data for some things, like 1 or 2 other questions, but they had too many of them that the data was not clean in terms of all of it represented.
Okay. I thought it was an online survey. I had a suggestion,
no.
But to call 1,000 plus person, that must have been quite timely and expensive. So kudos to you.
So kudos to Dr. Dhanai and all of his friends and family members who, thank God, we were collecting data when people were in lockdowns at home. So this was at the start of COVID. People were in lockdown, but we were doing reflective of the period from June to December 2019. So at the time we were calling around people, a lot of people, I mean, he had people who had some time to help him.
Good stuff.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We do hope that you'll join again for our next research seminar series. Thank you and have a great day.